Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Career Bootcamp 2022. I'm Maxine Byam and will be moderating today's session. When demonstrating your experience, keep it simple, s'il vous plaît. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land I work on each day is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, which is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I would also like to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Some of you may be joining us from various parts of this country, and I therefore encourage you to take a moment to recognize and acknowledge the territory that you're occupying. A few housekeeping items for today. As we move through today's session, please share your comments in the chat space and questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can vote for questions you like by clicking on the thumbs up button. The question with the most thumbs up will float to the top, and those will be the ones that we ask the panel. Let's review the learning objectives for this segment. After this session, participants will be able to understand that longer explanations are not more thorough than concise ones, demonstrate in writing their experience in a condensed way that meets screening criteria, and feel confident in their ability to describe experience factors simply and in plain language. Today, we have three great panelists joining us. Holly Palen is the Director of Innovation and Youth Engagement Division at Environment and Climate Change Canada. Holly holds a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Sciences from the University of Guelph and a Master's in Environmental Studies from Dalhousie University. She is passionate about governance and engagement and is also a certified change management practitioner. Welcome, Holly. Lily Spek is currently the recruitment lead for Canada's free agents. She is passionate about engagement, collaboration, learning, policy, and communications. Her past free agent assignments include Canadian Heritage, the Federal Youth Network, Indigenous Services Canada, Canada's Free Agents, Immigration, Citizenship and Refugees Canada, and the Privy Council Office. She holds a Master's of Public Administration. My apologies. I'm giving you new degrees, Lily, and a Bachelor of Public Affairs and Policy Management from Carleton University. Welcome, Lily. And finally, we have Charlie Tsao, who's a member of the Public Service Renewal Secretariat at the Privy Council Office since 2015, and he provides advice and support on outreach and engagement. Before joining the Privy Council Office, Charlie was an economist at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, where he focused on the analysis of farm performance and structures. Charlie is always curious about new ways to engage audiences, so please feel free to reach out to him on social media at Renew Excellence. Welcome, Charlie. Some competitions have thousands of applicants, and administrators simply don't have the time to dig deep into your past experiences. Showing them how you meet the criteria in a concise way is easier for them and easier for you. Before we get started today, we're going to ask you to answer a poll question. Marcella will launch and you will have 30 seconds to respond, then we'll review the results together. The poll question is, how long is your cover letter?
Five more seconds.
Okay, so we have a lot of one-page cover letters, 13% in 2 pages and a few sprinkled a little bit longer. So today we're going to talk about, is a long cover letter better than a short one? I think we're leaning towards a short one right now, but we'll be able to confirm that as we move through the panel. I'm going to ask Charlie to kick off today's discussion with some advice on what to do once you get the poster and how you might be successful in a process. Take it away, Charlie.
Thanks, everyone. Two things. So I will also keep my response short and simple, so number one. And number two, when that pop-up quiz came up, I freaked out a little bit. It's like, oh, am I supposed to answer as well? Because to be super honest, that varies quite a bit. And maybe if there's three things that I could share with everyone when it comes to sharing our experiences, how we describe them, there are three things that I ascribe to that have helped me over the years as a public servant. So maybe I'll list them off and perhaps later on when there's questions, I'm happy to delve a little bit deeper into them. So three things. As the title says, keep it simple. But at the same time, well, you also have to have the ability to explain it to a 5-year-old. So what I'm saying there truly is that long doesn't necessarily mean bad. Short doesn't mean good either. So I'll leave that first with everyone. And then secondly is approach. Have a consistent way to approach how you describe your experiences, who you are, what you do. And so in that sense, a starting point is to know really, really well who you are as a public servant or as an employee of a different sector hoping to coming into the public service. So that's number one. And tying back to the first point then is really have a consistent method. Really how I break it down when it comes down to how we keep it concise is truly three really basic fundamental building blocks as I interpret them is what your role is, when and how long you've done it for, and what did you actually do, and what did it mean? And so a lot of people will tell you different things, right? There are different ways to approach it. There's a lot of people probably throughout the last day and today, you may have heard the STAR method, the situation, tasks, actions, and results. And there are other ways too, right? You probably will have heard the CAR method, context, action, and result, or PAR, problem, action, and results. It all really ties back to the same thing. What did you do? How long you did it for? What did it mean? What were the impacts? And so just think of a way for it to be easy to you naturally when you're thinking about, okay, this is the situation I want to describe. How do I approach it? Consistency will help with knowing how to explain it to a 5-year-old and that it's concise enough, but also not too short that I don't really know what so-and-so did. So that's my second point. And then my third point is, as far as I know, public service applications are still manually scanned. So someone is going through all these applications. And so then there are two things. If it's too long, your message might get lost. But if it's too short, your message is lost either way. And then even if you have it down packed, even if you have a way to do it, there's individuals in departments that are reviewing it. Everyone is going to interpret how you describe yourself a little differently. So what's the best way to tackle that? So then it's not really a matter of tackling, it's a matter of getting more perspectives. So getting a colleague you trust to review it, getting a mentor perhaps, and that's a whole nother topic, but someone who could honestly give you some feedback in terms of, hey, is the way I'm describing myself making sense to a group of people? And everyone's going to give you something different. But when there's starting to be a theme, like, oh, okay, maybe I could tone it down a little bit more here and amp it up a little bit more at different areas. So again, very, very simply is to say that long doesn't mean bad. Short doesn't mean good either. How do you explain it to a 5-year-old? But keep it simple. Have a consistent way to approach every time you're describing an experience. So it's not like, oh my gosh, I'm looking for a new way to describe myself again. If it's consistent, it won't be as overwhelming. A lot of times there might be quite a few essential experiences in an application, in a poster. And in some cases, it's going to require more than 2 pages. And so don't fret. But at the end of the day, have someone help you peer review it. have a mentor help you, or a manager who's open to it. Because at the end of the day, we're all human. We're going to interpret things differently. So I'll end it there for this question. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Charlie. You raised some really great points there. And I especially like the idea of having someone just double check your answers for you, make sure you're communicating what you're hoping to. Now we'll have Holly share some tips on keeping it short when writing an experience factor or really any document. Take it away, Holly.
Yeah, thanks so much. And Charlie raised a lot of really good points. Maybe just to back up a minute, I think when we're thinking about job applications in the public service, sometimes if you're newer in your career, it's hard to understand all of the terminology that's used in the job posters and things like that. So one thing that's maybe useful as a starting point is to really understand what's in the poster and what the merit criteria are. And the merit criteria are obviously those experience or other factors that you are going to have to pass. And so it really is a checkbox exercise. And as you're rating your answers, it's really important to reuse the same wording and the exact same words that are in the question or the experience that's being looked for. So if, for example, it says, you know, you need to demonstrate experience in collaboration, then I would be really clear and say, I have experience in collaboration. And then, as Charlie said, you know, I gained this experience in my role as, with the dates and the location, etc. So Charlie mentioned the STAR method. Another way to think about it is, you know, the who, what, when, where, why, how. Make sure that you're really clear and structured, as Charlie said, in your answers so that the assessor doesn't have to guess. A common mistake that's often made is, like, you'll see applications and someone, you know, starts to tell kind of a story from their own perspective of their experience, but they can forget to use the I word and clearly explain their role, because we tend to want to celebrate the fact that we were part of a team. But it's really important in a job application to keep in mind that you have to use the word I, and your role and the extent of your abilities need to come through in that demonstration of experience. Also, one thing to watch out for with experience is sometimes you'll see words about recent or significant. And so if that is there, make sure that you address it in your answer. So recent, you know, you might say, like as Charlie said, I worked on this, or I demonstrated this capacity. You know, I use my organizational skills on a daily basis over the last 2 years in my role as. So it's being very specific, and just to remember that the assessor really has to be able to check off the evidence in your answer. And so we can't read between the lines, even though it might appear that you have more. If it's not directly said, it just unfortunately won't pass. So those are a few kind of key things I would suggest to keep in mind, and happy to come back and share some more ideas as well.
Thanks, Holly. And that point that you raised about making sure you use those I statements instead of talking about the team effort, that's definitely tripped me up in the past. So it's an excellent reminder. And now we're going to move to Lily, who's going to give us a little bit of context on the risks of being too concise. Take it away, Lily.
I think definitely, as Charlie and Holly were pointing out, there's a real balance to be struck. There isn't an exact right length for every application. You sort of have to take a look at the poster and decide how much space you're going to need to give them enough information to go on to hire you. And the real key is to focus on what they're asking you. It sounds silly, and that, like, obviously you're going to focus on what they're asking you, but keep going back to that job poster and looking for what they've directly asked you for and focus on those pieces. And I would say wherever possible, like map out your answers ahead of time with those key points that you want to ensure that you cover so that you're not leaving stuff off the table that's really relevant to your experience. You're giving them everything they need. And then that will give you sort of a roadmap that you can flesh out as you write your answer. It keeps you on track and it lets you ensure that you really get the information that you want to across to that person assessing. And then I would say as well, you can edit. Whatever you put down on as your first draft for this answer, it's not written in stone. You didn't put it on like an engravable tablet. Please feel free to edit. So if you go through right next to that job poster and you see you've added a bunch of information that pertains to some other criteria that they're not asking for, take that out. Save it somewhere so you can use it in future, but take it out so that you're actually giving them just what they've asked for. That goes to another point that I think is really critical. You're going to be doing job applications throughout your career. A couple great tips for how to keep on topic are to actually, as you're going through a job, write down and take notes about each task or project that you complete so that you have that information later. It'll save you tons of time when you're writing job applications. And then also save the answers that you prepare for these job applications because you'll be asked variations on these themes throughout your career. And it's really handy to be able to go back and think, actually, I have 5 years experience on collaboration with Holly and with Charlie, actually. I've worked with both of them in the past. So I think as well, it's really critical that, as Holly was mentioning, to keep repeating those key phrases or key criteria from the job poster, because it means, even if it feels silly, that the assessor doesn't have to guess. You want to give them as much chance as possible to screen you in. And if you give them exactly what they asked for, then you're that much more likely to try and get to the next stage of the process. And I will say this because I know it can feel inhuman applying on jobs.gc.ca, but nobody wants to screen you out. Nobody. We all are up there putting up a job poster because we truly want to find someone who's a great fit. So give us the best chance possible to screen you in by giving us the things that we've asked for in that job poster and nothing extra, but a full explanation of how you meet those criteria. And I guess on that team versus I point of view, I think it's really great to mention that you were part of a team, but then hone in on exactly what your contribution was and what the impacts were of the work that you did. You can do both, but just make sure that you give that focus and give the assessor a clear idea of what you brought to the table and what impact it has. So if you're not comfortable using a more complex method like STAR or CAR or other rhyming words to present your answer, I would say focus on your contribution and impact, and that will get you a lot of the way there. I think I'll leave it at that for now, Maxine, and we'll head back into the group.
Thanks, Lily. And I really like the idea that you raised about keeping track of your experience as you're in the role. It's so easy to kind of forget some of the pieces or some of the experience that you have when it's, you know, a year later and you're doing this new job application. So it's a great point. Okay, so lots to think about from Holly, Charlie, and Lily. And now we have a couple of pre-planned questions for the panel that we'll start with. For the audience members, this is your chance to input some questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, or to upvote some of the questions that are already there. So I'm going to start with Charlie. Tell us, who's checking our credentials? Is there a computer scanning for keywords? How exactly does this work?
So I would say it's a version of that. Right now, there's not, as far as I know, as far as the intel that I've gotten, as far as last minute, just a few minutes ago before we started this session, is that currently, as far as I know, things are still done manually. But what is done manually is not so different from what these softwares are doing, right? There's a lot of applications at any given one point for really popular positions. So then, depending on the organization, department, or agency, there could be subtle nuances between how each organization handle their applications. But usually, the HR department will take the first stab at what are some of the key things that they're looking for. And it comes back to what all our esteemed colleagues have just mentioned, is what steps have you taken to provide that evidence? And it has to be pretty clear, because as someone who's reading hundreds, sometimes even more, of applications, they're looking for, okay, this is sufficient evidence that tells me this person has this essential qualification. And so that maybe there isn't a software that's as sophisticated as that yet, but there is discretion exercise. It is currently manually done before it goes to the group, or potentially groups, plural, of people who are looking for talent. Thanks.
Thanks, Charlie. And in case you've missed it, your cats are getting some good love in the chat right now. Lots of comments coming in about how cute your cat is.
Thank you. I forgot to close my door, and yeah, happy to share.
No, it's all good. Okay, so Lily, can you tell us, does the terminology that we're using make a difference?
Yeah, I would say it makes a huge difference. I think we spoke to it a little bit, saying that you're going to look at what that job poster is asking you. The people who work on these posters in the background, including myself, when we do things like hire free agents, think really carefully about what we're trying to look for in the right candidate. So those word choices like cabinet documents, or collaboration, or engagement, or experience in data science, whatever it may be, they were really carefully chosen to try and hone in on the right candidate who will be able to help us accomplish the work that we're doing, because that's why we're hiring. We're trying to serve Canadians through a whole variety of different types of jobs. So those terminology pieces, those phrases, they're really, really carefully selected. So when you look at a job poster, it's really worth reflecting on whether you think you'd be a good fit. I heard in a session yesterday that if you see something that doesn't feel like it's maybe part of what you already know, so for example, I don't have a lot of experience with data science, maybe if I want to work in a job like that, it means that I'm going to take the time to develop some of that skill set, whether that happens to be doing it off the side of my desk project, whether it means volunteering, whatever it may be. But using those key pieces of terminology that are in the job poster will help the assessor know that you understand that your experience is a good match for the job. And it also shows us that you've taken the time to sort of critically reflect on whether this is a good fit for you. So definitely, I know that there's lots of people out there applying to almost every job under the sun because they really are interested in moving up or moving to a different classification or trying something different. But I would say that terminology is really key, and then tailor your answer to that terminology and to the job poster so that they know you've really understood.
Thanks so much, Lily. Okay. Holly, what mistake do you commonly see qualified candidates make that gets them eliminated from processes?
Sure, and unfortunately this does happen a lot because we can often tell, from someone's CV or what they've said in other questions that they might be a really good candidate for the position. But again, if the essential qualifications aren't clear enough that we can check them off, then we can't pass the individual. And so I think another common mistake is not noticing if there's more than one part to a question. So you will unfortunately see criteria that include more than one element. And so it's important to pay attention to that. And, it's a simple oversight, but it happens, right? Where someone will focus on the first part or the second part and not give an answer that covers the full breadth of the experience or other type of competency that's being looked for. So that's just a simple reminder, but, making sure that your answer clearly addresses both parts. And I've often used subheadings in my answers to make it as clear as possible that you're addressing every element. So that's just a little tip that can be helpful to make it easier for the assessor to recognize where your answer is relating to the appropriate question. So that's just a little thing to note. Obviously I mentioned before, but the I is really, really critical. Make sure it's clear what your role was and how you achieved the result. So making your role clear and how did you achieve it. And actually that's one place where you can bring in and kind of allude to other related elements. So for example, if it's an experience question and you're saying you demonstrated your organizational skills by whatever project at this time for this duration, you can add in an allusion to, I applied my organizational skills that I learned through this program that I took, or at the end, and I was awarded a certificate in organizational skills. So sometimes there's ways of like re-emphasizing your point by adding on a little phrase without making it too long. So sometimes that can be kind of a helpful way to emphasize that you have a depth of experience in addition to the example you're giving. So that's another thing to think about as you're crafting your answer.
Those are some great points, Holly. And I especially like, in the 2-part question or 3-part question, using some headings to make sure both you know and the reader knows that you've answered the question in its totality. Okay, so we're going to move on to some questions for the audience. As a reminder, if you have questions, you can post them in the Q&A section, and popular questions will be the ones that we address today. So let's get started. Our first question is, in a cover letter format-wise, is it better to have headings with paragraphs separated by job experience, or are bullet points okay too? Basically, how should it be formatted? Any volunteers?
I can grab it. Oh, I see Holly's hand though. Holly with far more polite.
Go ahead, Lily.
Okay, I'll start and then you can take over if you've got other pieces. I would say I actually really don't mind bullets as long as they're in a structure that makes clear that you're about to provide a list of some kind. So I don't want to see a letter that says like, hi, my name is Bob, I'm interested in this job, and then puts a whole number of bullets about why they're qualified. But I think that there's a space in a cover letter to use them when you are providing like a list of different places or something like that. That's visually a lot easier to read. But I would say like stick to good grammar and spelling practices wherever possible. And so make a judgment call about whether bullets actually fit in your cover letter or not. Holly?
Sure, it's a great question. I think, well, from my advice or perspective, headings and subheadings are almost always essential to be able to fit the model of job applications in the public service. Unfortunately, it's so different from what you would think of as a cover letter in other contexts. So I think for me, you could have bullet points sometimes, but the important thing is to make sure that you've got the narrative clear enough to explain how those bullet points are relevant to the question or experience, because like a CV is more where you usually have your bullet points. Whereas to me, usually in the cover letter, it's more where you're telling the story, you're convincing someone. So it's really a little bit of a different approach. But of course, sometimes they might be relevant. I think, I did want to just pick up, if I could, on the cover letter question, though, more generally, because sometimes you may, and CV stands for your resume or your curriculum vitae. But sometimes in government, obviously, you can reach out, outside of the formal jobs.gc.ca processes when you're looking for a casual, a term, a deployment, all kinds of opportunities come up outside of those formal processes. And when it comes to that type of cover letter, I would say in that context, it's a completely different story. And to me, as a hiring manager, when I get those types of messages, for me, like as short as possible, coming back to the topic of our subject or our session, is really critical. And it could be, maybe 4 or 5 lines. It can be really short. Why did you reach out to me? Like, what are you bringing to me in terms of your skills or experience? And make an ask. So it's, I'm interested in your job because, or interested in that area because, and you can relay your passion. I think I'm qualified, or I'd be a good candidate because. You can mention a recent experience or a degree, and then an ask. would you be willing to meet with me? And in that context, being really short and to the point is useful. If I get a generic type of cover letter, honestly, I'm not going to wade through it and try to figure out why someone might be a good fit. So I know that's a little off track, but I just thought I would share that as well. Thank you.
No, that's a really good point, Holly. There are a lot of different ways that people might be looking to reach out to hiring managers. So good to have that context as well. Okay, let's move to our next question. Outside of the obvious, which is including the information you are specifically told to include on a GC job poster, what specific types of information should you include in your cover letter? Additionally, should you include any personal information to humanize yourself? Charlie, take it away.
Maybe I'll start. I'm sure my esteemed panelists will have more to add to this, but this is a really good question. So maybe I'll work my way backwards. So humanizing a cover letter. And so then this comes back to all what we're saying this whole time is your investment in time and how you want to describe yourself. And at the end of the day, you have to be true to yourself. If that's how you want to describe yourself, then that's important to you, by all means. But is it necessary? No, because how I see it, you humanize yourself when you're at the interview. Let's get you through the application process. Let's get you screened in. And how you show yourself as an individual is at the interview. Because at the end of the day, all we're reading is words on a piece of paper, right? And everyone's going to interpret it differently. So how you're humanizing yourself may not even translate for some people. So that's one thing. So it's like, what do you really want to invest your time on? How do you be concise? And this is where potentially going into too much detail might be a diminishing return. So that's one part of it. And the other part of it, I would say, be as concise as you can in terms of listing out. So who you are, what department you're working for right now, what's your level. Those are all very, very critical things to do as a start. So who you are, what are you doing right now? And then really have one or two sentences. Sometimes people do more in terms of this is what the position I'm going for. Sometimes if you want to be even more concise, this is the process number in which I'm applying for, and go straight into headings in terms of this experience 1, 2, 3. And then it's coming back to the first question, does it need to be bullet point? Does it need to be paragraphs? As long as it helps you be concise, and as long as you have a consistent approach, doesn't really matter. However you want to approach it, as long as you hit it, you can provide sufficient evidence that you've hit it, then I think we're good. Thanks.
Thanks, Charlie. Lily, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I'll just make it quite brief. I think that you can outline what your experience is and really hit the high points through that cover letter. But my recommendation is always to keep it as much plain language as possible, just because your experience may be in an area or in a department or a group that your interviewer or assessor is unfamiliar with. So if you keep it plain enough, then it actually lets them have a better chance of really understanding that your experience is relevant. And I would say that like a good time to like humanize the cover letter a little bit is in that piece that Charlie talked about, where you're talking about like the job that you're actually applying for, or talking about what type of job you're looking for and why. And that can be pretty short. It can be even a sentence or two saying that you're looking for X type of position because you're passionate about this area, because you've had experience either in the volunteer sector or in your education and you really want to work in that area. So I think there are ways to add a bit of that human touch to it. Also talking about your experience using language that indicates not only that you have that experience, but that you're passionate about it for whatever reason, I think gives you those ways of incorporating the human side while still actually delivering all the information that that assessor is going to look for in your CV.
Thanks, Lily. Those are some really great points. Okay, let's move on to our next question. SC is asking, is there such a thing as being too specific about your job when answering questions? Often I struggle with knowing how much background information to give about my current role to ensure that the reader or interviewer knows what I'm talking about without it being too much filler.
Yeah, sure, I can jump in. It's really tricky, honestly. Like it's something I've struggled with a lot myself in applications, knowing I don't want to be too long, but at the same time, trying to give a bit of context, right? Because it is important to be able to, for the assessor to be able to judge like to what degree of experience you have depending on the level of position you're applying for, because the expectation is going to be different if you're applying for an entry level position where you have to demonstrate, to a question in the comments, engagement, versus the level of engagement and level of expertise you'll be expected to have if you are applying to a more senior manager type position. So I do think you need to be able to communicate a little bit about that context. So for example, if you're talking about engagement, public engagement activities, you would need to say a little bit about the context where you work, who were you working for, who were the parties you were engaging with, was it, and at what level were they, for example, was it hundreds of organizations across the country? Was it talking to a few local organizations? Like, you do have to give a little bit of context because you want to demonstrate that there's a little bit behind you saying you have that experience, right? And so the assessor can understand a bit of the degree and the scope of your role. So yes, a little bit of context is good, but you don't have to go into too much about, why that engagement process was created or, as an example. Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, those are some great points. Charlie or Lily, would you like to add anything?
Maybe just to say that I've struggled with the same thing. I think throughout your career, you try and find that balance of giving enough information so that the person really knows that you have what the job requires, but also leaving out any extraneous information. So I think that context piece, where possible, and I think it, like similar to the personalizing, you can add context to almost any of your experience that you're sharing by adding like one additional sentence. So try and keep yourself concise while still giving enough of an indication that they can understand the link between the experience and the job.
Charlie, go ahead.
I'll just add very, very quickly is that even in our interpretation of that question, it also is going to vary very slightly. So again, it only comes back to my original point that everyone's going to interpret things a little bit differently. To me, when I read specific, I mean, are you getting straight to the point? And so in that way, is it long? Maybe not. And if in your heart you really feel that, hey, these are the things I must describe before I get there to provide my evidence, then maybe that's it. But then this is where, again, coming back to my earlier point, having someone read it is like, hey, is there a certain point where I could leave out? And then it comes back to Lily's point too, right? Like there's nothing wrong with editing it, going back to it a little bit later and to see, okay, cool, maybe there's things I could leave out, or there are things that I missed that I need to put in. Thanks.
Thanks, Charlie. Let's go to our next question. I found it's very easy to be repetitive in the screening questions, especially if you have limited examples to provide. For example, complex project that hits points in collaboration and project management. Does it hurt you in the process to use the same example more than once? Lily, go ahead.
So much easier than the other raise hand. I would say, honestly, it kind of depends on what point in your career you're at, especially if you're more a junior public servant, or if you've made a big career change and you're coming in with less experience in the area that the job is in. I don't think it hurts your chances to use the same example. Where I think it might hurt your chances if you don't differentiate between those two questions. So I think you can say, like, also at the job that I mentioned previously, I did this, this, and this. Like, you really need to split out the different criteria or experience/skill set into two very distinct answers, even if it's from the same job. But if you're further along in your career and you've had opportunities to do the same types of work in a variety of different places, I think it's a great idea to bring in experience from different spaces to show that you've got that that sort of diverse experience in different groups, different types of teams, different types of subject matter. But I don't think it hurts you if you're early on in your career and you only have limited experience to draw on. Just really like push hard on your explanation to make sure that it's very clear how that job experience links to that particular criteria.
I also feel like this is something that, you know, if you're pivoting from one area of your career to another, you might only have limited experience in this new area that you're trying to move towards. So yeah, that was a really great question and explanation, Lily. Okay, so our next question is, what are the key elements to highlight in a cover letter so that we're not just repeating what's already in our resume? Holly, go ahead.
Sure. I think the thing about the cover letter is you're really trying to tell the story and be convincing. So it's different where the cover, well, in my view anyway, the cover letter is the facts. It's like, I can see where you got your education. I can see what courses you have, or, you know, what your job history was. And from that, I can guess and interpret things. But the cover letter is where you have to tell me in your words and convince me that based on that experience, here's why you fit this particular job. Because the CV is usually used for different positions and not everything is going to be relevant, right? And usually in the CV, it's more fact-based. And obviously your CV is fact-based too, but that's where you have the opportunity, as Lily said, to make the link and be a little more targeted in articulating how that experience will help you in this role. So it's definitely going to repeat what's in your CV, but it's rephrasing it and putting it in a different context.
Sorry. Let's go to our next question. Thank you, Holly, for that response. Emily's asking, if I'm using this multiple examples from the same job, do I need to repeat the who, what, where, when every time? Lily?
I can jump in quickly. I usually try and, actually this is a good rule. If you're going to use an acronym in your cover letter, make sure you define it the first time it's used. Even though we all work for the government of Canada, it's like an acronym soup in here, and they're like somebody one sector over in the same department. I might not know all of the acronyms for all of the various files, the different types of organizations they work with, and then all of the shops within their own directorate. So define your acronyms, but then I would say you can just briefly introduce the fact that it's referring back to that same job. I don't think you need to talk about all those key pieces again. A good way to do that as well, if you're going to be using that same example, is to set up with like a sentence or two saying like, from this time period, I worked in this shop for the following team, working on this file, I was lead, or whatever it happens to be. And then you can break out the individual pieces that relate back to that particular job. But I don't think you have to go through that full explanation each time. But you definitely do need to pull it back to what your individual contribution was. So I'd say focus on that within each of those pieces that you're going to write about.
Could I just add briefly to that? I think that was a really good point about, you know, defining acronyms and things like that. I would say be sure in each answer to include all those details, like your role, your date, the organization you work for. It needs to be in each question because your answer might be slightly different, you know, and so we're not going to guess that like, oh, because you said you had experience in organizational skills in experience one over this time period, that doesn't necessarily mean that you had the same experience in collaboration over that time period. So you have to be clear, I would say, and make sure you do include those elements in each question. But as Lily said, you don't have to necessarily repeat everything, but make sure you've got those pieces.
Thanks for
And
those.
it's okay that it's repetitive, like they are extremely repetitive. That's okay.
Thanks for those points, Holly and Lily. Okay, Sandra is asking us, when it comes to using poster vocabulary, do you need to repeat the key words, e.g., for example, collaboration in every paragraph? Or is the start and maybe a repeat once enough? Holly?
I can jump in on that. So I'll answer this question, but also relate to another question I saw in the chat. So I would repeat it a couple times. You might be able to use a synonym, for example, but you know, be really clear in your statement that I have experience in collaboration by doing this, like how you gained it, how you applied it. And you're probably going to have a bit of an opening statement that says something general like that. And then in your answer, you'll probably have another statement that'll explain it a little bit more, right? More focused on exactly what they're looking for in the question. So yeah, don't hesitate to repeat it. I think you probably will have to answer the question, honestly. Otherwise, it might get a little bit hard for the assessor to guess why you're talking about certain things if it's not clearly reusing some of the same wording. And if you're not sure what some of the words mean, if you are, you know, if you have access to your HR intranet, there are, at least at Environment and Climate Change Canada, for example, there's a database of these terms and definitions, and you can access that and help yourself understand a little bit what it is that assessors might mean by some of the keywords that they're using. I'm not sure, I was trying to check if there was a resource like that available to everyone in government, but definitely check on your Human Resources intranet page and see if you can find something like that, because that can be really helpful. Sometimes it's hard to guess what's meant by some of the words, and that can help you understand what they're looking for.
That's a really excellent point, Holly. And I know, at least in the department that I'm currently working at right now, there are actually varying definitions based on the position that you're going for. So when they use the word collaborate, for example, for someone at a PM1 versus a PM5, what you need to do to demonstrate that will be very different. So yeah, thanks for suggesting that resource to us. Charlie or Lily, is there anything that you wanted to add?
I would say just that when you're answering a question about collaboration or whatever it may be, you're sort of like building a response for the person. And so you want to make sure that you pull in all the elements that like paint that whole picture for them. And yes, it may be repetitive. I think as long as you use the words or the terminology from the poster in that introductory sentence, then you can break into using synonyms to explain how you actually meet that criteria. The goal here, I think, is so that the person immediately sees that you understand what the ask was and that you're responding to it. And so having that first sentence include the exact terminology lets them know you understand, and then you can break into like a more human way of explaining it that actually makes you feel like you're sharing your story and what you've done.
Thanks, Lily. Okay, let's move on to our next question. A really great one from John. Can the cover letter have too many sentences starting with I? Can I be overdone? Lily, go for it.
I feel like I struggle with this in every place in my life, whether it's emails, etc. It feels like I'm always starting sentences with I. And I would say that it's not super problematic in this type of case because we are really looking for what your experience is, but there are a lot of different ways to try and pull something else into the beginning of that sentence that speaks to either the place you worked, the time period, or your experience, such that you don't have to necessarily use I. So like while working for PCO, PSRS with Charlie on Blueprint 2020. I did the following, which speaks to my experience on collaboration. I led the volunteer component for the innovation fair, designing training, walkthrough, etc. So I think that you just want to find some places probably for ease of readability to add in something else at the beginning of the sentence, but you're going to talk about yourself a lot because it's a cover letter, and that's okay.
Thanks, Lily. Let's move on to our next question. If you have a lot of experience that you feel is relevant, should you prioritize just the most recent experience or the experience in which you had the greatest impact? Sometimes there are word limits and there isn't enough space to address both if those experiences are different. Holly, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, that's a hard one because I know myself, I'd like to show experience from different, like, you know, that my experience is deep and therefore I've gained it in different contexts. But if you're really limited in the amount of space you have to respond, then you'll have to look for those keywords about recent or significant. If they're there, then that'll tell you which example to use. If it has to be recent, i.e. the last 2 or 3 years, you know, you'll have to use that example, even if it isn't as good an example in your opinion. You'll just have to try to word it such a way that you're able to demonstrate how you still gain that sufficient experience in that example. If, however, the question makes reference to significant or other terms like that, then pick your example that you feel, you know, best meets that criteria. So my, you know, lean to would be towards the one that best demonstrates your skills and breadth of experience and so on. But if it gets to be too far in the past, it's not always seen as relevant by assessors. So it is a bit of a judgment call, unfortunately.
Thanks, Holly. Okay, let's move on to our next question. For those of us who are new to the public service, for example, 1 year or less, how should we approach screening questions that ask for significant experience?
Sorry, Charlie, did you want to go?
I'll answer very quickly and I'll pass it over to you, Holly. So this is where I think judgment is also very important, right? Like so it's a reality check. It's like, okay, this is looking for significant experience in what? Am I really qualified for it? Am I confident that I am qualified for it? If so, then by all means, maybe there are experiences from your private sector life or whatever NGO life, or even in school that you have attained some of those experiences that you could show evidence. Absolutely, that could be used, and there's nothing wrong against that. And so then again, really truly ask yourself, do you have that significant experience? If it's from outside of public service, that is totally okay. You could totally pull this off. Thanks.
Holly, is there anything you wanted to add? Okay. Yeah, I know it's a really great point to use experience from across your life, whether it's volunteering or otherwise. Okay, so for our next question, how can applicants have a chance to learn to do a job at a higher level when job postings require you to already be at that level to qualify? It's difficult to apply for a promotion if the system is rigged against you. Holly, go ahead.
Sure, I think Lily will have lots of suggestions on this front too, but it is a really good question. I think to Charlie's point, sometimes, you know, the experience you gain outside of your core job can be enough to help you demonstrate you have experience in addition to what your current job is showing. When it comes to needing to get to that next level to apply for other jobs at that level, that is tricky, but there are a lot of ways that you can gain experience in your current role. So You might have heard of micro assignments or micro missions. That is a very excellent way to gain experience outside of your current role in a semi-formal manner. It's not an HR action. All it requires is an agreement between your current manager and another manager for you to spend a little bit of your time working on a project outside of your current team. So you might have skills in project management. You might have a skill in graphic design or something like that, and you're hoping to build that for your career to get your next position, but you're not getting enough opportunities in your current role. Talk to your manager, see if you can explore doing a micro assignment for another team that really needs that skill. It's an excellent way to build your resume, and it's an excellent way to contribute your skills to the public service as a whole and make sure that your full, breadth of talents are contributing to the public service objectives. So that is one way that you might be able to help you achieve those requirements to be able to get that next position. Obviously, from more of an HR formal mechanism are assignments. So depending on your current type of employment in the public service, assignments are also a really excellent way to go. They can be hard to get approved, obviously, because your manager has to let you go, and they often don't want to do that. But, it's always worth exploring those opportunities as well. Just a couple thoughts. Lily, would you like to add to that?
Yeah. Thinking back to micro missions, they're great, really great way also to bring different skill sets into your team that you're looking for that you don't have. I would say there's other things you can also leverage with your current role, which is the learning plan as part of your performance management. There's a lot of space in there for you to identify things that you want to take on, whether that's understanding supervisory experience or working on your French. So that you have better French levels as you go for promotions in the future. So I would say speak to your current supervisor or manager and start incorporating those things into your learning plan, because there are ways that you can do those things within the scope of the job that you're in today without going anywhere else. And then I would say as well that it's come in on the experience front, but it feeds directly in outside the job. Whatever you're passionate about. I definitely know other free agents within the program who manage events on the sides or run their own nonprofits. And all of those things, whether they include overseeing other people, other staff, or managing large budgets, those things are all relevant when you're bringing in experience to talk about applying for a job. So I would say feel free to look outside your current role. I have lots of friends who volunteer for different charitable foundation boards, things like that. There's lots of ways you can get involved so you can both give back to your community and build your experience at the same time, which can be really fulfilling.
Absolutely. Charlie, I saw your hand pop up for a second. Is there anything that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I'll just ask super quickly. This is an excellent question, but also a little bit loaded, just because I do believe this question is outside of the topic of this session alone, because this speaks to more, how do I gain experiences to advance in my public service career? Really, that's what the question is getting at. And so this is a whole nother conversation. And what Holly and Lily have spoken to is really, really key, is within the job that you have right now, how are you finding opportunities so that you do have those experiences, whether it be through working with the community within your community, working within on some volunteering project, maybe even. How do I find those opportunities? And yes, there are probably some deeper conversations with your manager, director, whoever, to say, how do I get those experiences? Or if I can't get it, what are the steps I can take to get there? Is it like what Holly's saying? Is it an assignment within the department? Is it a micro assignment? Is there any volunteering opportunities? So on and so forth. But happy to come back to that later if that question comes up again. Thanks.
Thanks, Charlie. Okay, let's move to our next question. How do I address job posters that specify experience of 12 months within the most recent 24 months, and I have the required number of months experience, but the experience may be older than the recent 24 months and sometimes gained outside the public service? How do I create a resume that gives me a chance?
This is tricky, honestly. I've been screened out because of that myself. One thing to note, and I don't know if this will apply, but just for your information, that happened to me coming back from a maternity leave. So I'd been off for a year. So I didn't feel I could say my experience was recent in the last 12 months. But you don't count leaves when they talk about that. You can't be discriminated against, or maybe I'm using harsh language, but you can't be, that can't count against you if you took a leave. So if you took a sick leave or a maternity leave or something like that, don't screen yourself out if you see those types of requirements. So that's just like one little tip that might not apply to many of you, but if it does apply to you, keep that in mind. Unfortunately, like you just have to be truthful in when that experience was gained, and it might screen you out, unfortunately, but it's worth making the case anyway, and see how it goes. But I find sometimes those requirements are not really necessary. Like they're sort of a way to screen people out. They usually aren't pertinent to the actual job requirements, in my opinion. But anyway, those are just a few thoughts on that.
I hope we see a move away from like really tight timelines on that, because I think it does penalize people who have taken leaves, and there'll be more and more people taking leaves to care for like elderly parents in the future. And with the pandemic hitting women unequally, I think as well, we're going to see people who've had to step away to take time for other reasons. So I would say, like, I echo Holly's sentiment about don't screen yourself out completely, because you also don't know who else is applying. They may not find anyone who has that experience within the last 12 months. So if your experience is relatively recent, like within the last, say, 2 to 3 years, I would still apply, because if they don't find the right fit, but you still have that experience, it's possible you may still be screened in. So give yourself a shot if you can.
Yeah, that last point was a really good one, Lily. Okay, Dan is asking, I've been in competitions where the post-briefing comments have been contradictory on the same information with the same questions. For example, one hiring manager said, "You're not saying enough here," and another said exactly the opposite using the same information. Where does one find the balance?
I think it's a really tough one, and every assessor or interviewer is going to be different, which is unfortunate, because there isn't like an exact recipe for how to get the answer to be exactly what they're looking for. But I think part of that as well, like I believe Charlie spoke to getting somebody else to review your work. I think that's super critical, especially someone, for example, who is not in the same field as you, who maybe doesn't work for government. My dad has asked me to edit like introductions to books on engineering that he's written. So you have a chance to actually see whether the information you've presented tells enough of a story with that person having zero context. And it's possible your assessor may have very little context about your job. So I would say that in those cases, that's your best bet to really get a sense of whether the person understands what you've tried to get at with your answer. But you definitely, I would say, take that feedback if you can. If you can get anything more specific out of those people when they tell you you've written too much or too little, like asking for which components are really missing, or alternatively, sometimes you can get someone to provide you with an example answer that hits all the highlights. Sometimes HR like assessment rubrics include something like that, and that's something you could also ask for to see if there's an example of what a really great answer or a high scoring answer might have provided to help you in your next competition.
Thanks, Lily. Okay, let's go to Christina's question. Often we hear that if you qualify for the majority of criteria on a job poster, you should still apply. Can the same mentality be used with GC jobs, or will you be screened out if you only meet 4 out of 5 criteria or have 18 months of experience instead of 24, for example? Holly, go ahead.
I think, sure, and that's a great question. I think maybe echoing what Lily said, you don't necessarily know how many other applicants there will be. So you can, apply anyway, because evidence suggests that particularly women often self-screen more than men when it comes to these kinds of things. So it's important to not prevent yourself from being considered. But if you honestly know that you don't have an essential criterion, it might not be worth your time. So it's going to depend. If you're close, I might go ahead anyway. But if it's really clear you don't have one of the essential experience factors, for example, then there isn't a likelihood that you will pass. So I'm not sure if that's helpful, but those are just a couple thoughts in relation to that question.
Thanks, Holly. Okay, let's go to our next question. Is there a qualification, if there is a qualification that is not asked for, but you think would be beneficial to the role, for example, leadership or communication, should you still try to highlight it?
I would say if there's a way to work it into your answers such that it actually relates to some of the other experience or criteria that they're asking for, that can be really helpful. So like, for example, in the area of collaboration, you could talk about leading an engagement community, overseeing and facilitating collaborative exercises, like we did collaboration cafes at Environment and Climate Change Canada. So I think if you can tie in the leadership or communication, for example, into one of the other qualifications, I think that will be a stronger case for including it in your cover letter. Sorry, I had to pick up this one who showed up in the background yelling, so.
Thanks, Lily. Holly, go ahead.
Sure. Can I just add quickly? I think to Lily's point earlier, she mentioned seeking feedback. So I think that's really important to note that if you have applied for, yes, and yay to the pets, I wish I had one. But if you do apply and you thought you had a great chance and you don't make it through, definitely ask if you can get the informal feedback on the process. It can be extremely eye-opening and really helpful. You may not agree with what the assessor tells you, but any data is good data in terms of feedback on your application. And that's one really good way to improve your chances the next round, recognizing that each assessor is an individual or a team, and they may interpret things somewhat differently depending on the point of view that they come from.
Thanks, Holly. Okay, so someone is asking, should you be providing your work email or personal email for contact, or both? Lily, go ahead.
I always provide both, but I did go through not the trouble, but the step of creating my own personal work email because I didn't want to be getting Gmail notifications all the time on my personal Gmail, but I did want an email that remains the same throughout my career, or at least my career as a free agent. It was a little bit easier a few years ago, I found, when we were in the glorious @canada.ca days, because my email would remain the same. At least in most of the places where I took a job, but I feel like having at least one consistent contact on there is a good idea. But I also include my government email in case there are things that are protected that they want to share or that type of thing. But it gives them an opportunity to reach me even if I've changed jobs. So I would recommend including both.
Thanks, Lily. There's another question that we have. When given examples, how many should we share? Is one enough, or do we need examples from across 2 or 3 years? Charlie?
I don't believe there's a rule to that. So whatever you believe is necessary in providing evidence. Sometimes I like 2, sometimes I like 3, and that's just at my own discretion. And I've done it in different ways and have gotten screened in. So really, it's how confident are you in that experience in describing yourself? And if you're confident, then maybe that's it. Or if you wanted to add a little bit more detail from other experiences, I would say by all means, there is not a rule to this. Thanks.
Thanks, Charlie. Okay, I'm getting confused with questions at the side here. Okay, should we use, okay, so somebody had brought up word limits earlier, and Lily is asking, should we use all of the space allowed in the screening questions, or is it okay to provide an example and only use, half of the max character space?
I don't think you need to use all of the space necessarily. I know that in certain situations, like within free agents, we have the same platform for both English and French, and I don't want to penalize the French speakers or those who are submitting in French, because French does take longer in terms of character counts to say the same thing. I would say like you're aiming to have a thorough explanation that gets your message across, but the point is not to fill the entirety of the space provided, it's to get your message across. So unlike when you're in school, if you submitted a 6-page paper for a 10-page paper assignment, it's okay as long as you hit all the high points and provide the information they need to know about you, but you don't need to fill that entire space.
Thanks, that's a really great point, Lily. Okay, Brent is asking, if my cover letter is too long, will it hurt my chances for a job interview? Holly, go ahead.
I think it depends on the context and the format. I mean, if it's a cover letter in the formal jobs.gc.ca portal and you have to touch on a whole bunch of criteria, then it's probably going to be long and not resemble a typical cover letter whatsoever. If it's other than like a nice little intro and conclusion, about why you want the job or something. But other than that, it's not really like a typical cover letter. If it's more of an informal reach out, like you're a student, you're looking for your next co-op opportunity, or you're seeking a casual position or even a term, and you're reaching out informally outside of the jobs.gc.ca process, then yes, I would say a cover letter that's too long is going to hurt your chances, because managers are super busy and they just want to quickly read, why is that person potentially someone I want to talk to? So it has to grab your attention, be really short and sweet and impactful. So it depends on the context.
Thanks, Holly. Charlie or Lily, is there anything else you wanted to add? Nope. Okay, let's move on to our next question. Emma's asking, do you have any suggestions on how to write about old job experiences that you somewhat forget? Because you didn't have the handy tips that we learned about writing things down as we go.
I would say a great idea is to dig back into your old resume stash, wherever that happens to be, because chances are at some point you wrote down a few points about that job to apply to other jobs. I would say before I realized in the federal government, for example, that I'm going to have like screening for security all the time, that I didn't really realize I needed to keep track of all my addresses. And so like there are hot tips out there, like go check your Amazon history and you will have all the addresses you ever shipped to, and then you'll be able to tell for your security screening. So I'd say like leverage all the possible opportunities you have, think outside the box, start Googling that job's name within your email, like basically do a search to see if you can find anything related to that job in your email, because you might have put it there, or for example, your Google Calendar. So there may be pieces or like artifacts from that job scattered through your life that you can start digging for. And definitely I know that at the beginning of my career, I didn't know to keep track of all those things. So I was in the same boat and had to be creative about how I dug for that information.
Holly, go ahead.
Sure, I can just add maybe 2 quick things on that. it just comes to mind because I worked with Lily and Charlie before, is if you still know some of your coworkers from that time, you know, don't hesitate to reach out to them, have a quick chat about the fact you're applying for a job and you're trying to pull together some examples, because other people will have a perspective of you that you might not think of, right? So your past coworkers can be really helpful. Don't forget to check your own like LinkedIn. And if you are in the government of Canada, don't forget to go back to your learning plans and performance reviews. If you've kept any of those, they will be like excellent ways to prompt you in terms of what you did and how you did it.
Those are great points. Yeah, learning plans can have a treasure trove of information from past managers and from your own comments that you keep in there. Charlie, I saw your hand pop up for a second. Is there anything else that you wanted to add?
I think Holly took it right out of my mouth, actually, is who can you reach out to in the past to help you remember? Or maybe the other way to look at it is like, oh, I can't really remember much. Is it worth including? So that's another reality check there. Thanks.
Thanks, Charlie. Okay, there's a question about moving from one field of work to another. How do we articulate our transferable skills to make us a more appealing candidate in the new field we are wishing to put our foot in the door for? Lily, go ahead.
I think this is one of the times when it's extra critical that you present your message in plain language. So I think there's lots of opportunities to pull pieces from that old job that may feel on the surface like it's a totally different field with nothing in common, to show that there are those transferable skills. So maybe maybe you worked at the patent office, for example, and you want to talk about which pieces of that job are relevant to policy analysis. So start picking apart the pieces of the tasks that you did and find those similarities, but you really need to have a stronger narrative, I would say, when it's outside that same field of experience. So you want to explain to the assessor how that experience is relevant to what they're asking for very, very clearly.
Thank you, Lily. Okay, so Jacob has a question for us. When explaining my past or current job experience on a resume, just how detailed or concise should my explanation be? I often struggle with how much detail to include on a resume. Holly, go ahead.
Sure, this is like such a good question, and it's so hard. Like, this is something I've struggled with constantly because I just want to share everything that I'm proud of, right? But I've really seen a change in the style of cover letters over the last few years, and people have gotten really good at being concise, and I'm super impressed. Oftentimes I notice, I mean, not that you can do this in a jobs.gc.ca portal, but if you're, again, outside of that, using infographics, having lots of little text boxes, bullet points, can really be helpful to telling a story that is impactful and relevant to the job you're applying for, as opposed to simply a generic CV. When it comes to the jobs.gc.ca portal, you know, it's text-based. You're not going to have that opportunity. So I find they tend to be a bit longer and listy. Just keep in mind, again, what are the key messages you're trying to get across for that particular job? And yes, you want to have your complete work history, but you might not need to have as many bullet points for the positions that aren't relevant to that position, that kind of thing. So keep your complete, you know, information there, so it's easy for dates and things like that to be checked. But at the same time, focus on the point of the job, and always include that list at the top that highlights your key relevant skills or experience, so that it's easy for the assessor to have a look at that.
Thanks, Holly. Our next question is, if a prior response applies to the next question, do you copy paste, or do you need to restate the question, the response differently? I'm losing my words now. Charlie, do you want to respond to that question?
Absolutely. And before I go on, just a quick shout out to you, Maxine. I know there's a lot of questions coming in, so thanks for keeping us organized. And I know we have 10 minutes left, so maybe it becomes like a final round situation. The questions in terms of copy and pasting, I think oftentimes it's not, if we're asking for experiences, it's not usually the same thing. So I would really, really look at what experiences are being asked, what essential qualifications are being asked before I respond. Yes, there are going to be similarities, but are they really the same? I would really start with that question first. Thanks.
Thanks, Charlie. And it looks like Lily has a few points.
Yeah, I would just say like customize. So if the question is, as Charlie says, it's probably not going to be the same question. It might be similar. So that means that the person who's asking for this question sees a clear distinction between the two. And so they really want to know that you understand the difference between them. So you could start off by copy and pasting the answer and then tailoring it so that it speaks to that exact piece. Because maybe it is the same project that gave you both of those pieces of experience, but they need to know you understand the difference.
Great point, Lily. Okay, let's see if we can get through maybe one or two more questions. Leanne is asking, how detailed should you be in answering questions with experience, such as MS Word, Excel, etc.? Is there a certain way to answer these software questions?
I include that stuff on my resume, and I would say if it's a specific question for the job in question, I might say the piece of software that they're speaking to, the number of years experience I have with it, and then what I've done with it, if they're asking that specifically. So if they're asking for like a database piece of software, say that I managed like a community of 500 different people through the database and was able to do like whatever exports and manipulation of data with it. If it happens to be something like the GC tools, for example, if you've done coding for the web pages on GCpedia, I would say like the time period and what your exact experience with it was, but I would probably be fairly brief with that.
Thanks, Lily. Okay, I'm going to call this our last question. There are a lot of competitions that are asking for lateral moves, often phrased are you ready for change? These typically cover several levels and have a closing date far into the future. Are there any tips when applying on these posters to have your application stand out? They typically don't ask a lot of screening questions. Holly, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a good question. And it is a more recent kind of trend or development. Definitely apply to those inventories. It's an excellent opportunity because generally they're being accessed by many different groups in an organization. So it's going to increase your chances of being seen by applying to those types of competitions. To make yourself stand out, it's kind of a hard question. I think it's just sort of the things we've been speaking to, right? Communicate your passion, communicate what skills and experience you bring, but while sticking to the questions, because in those cases, it's usually, in my experience anyway, it's human resources who will pull from that inventory, and they might do like a pre-screen and give someone however many candidates to look through. So you'll be assessed, but with a large volume, you just want to make sure you tick off all the essential pieces to make sure you're screened in and go from there.
Yeah, I would say honestly that a way to stand out in these things is actually to do what Holly says, to answer the question very clearly so that the assessor gets everything they need. It sounds a little bit weird, but it is actually special and not as common for people to be able to do that. Filling out these job applications, understanding how to write these CVs and answer these questions is a skill set within the government, and that will help you stand out among the crowd who's applying.
Thanks, Lily. And I see someone dropped in the, oh, sorry, Holly, go ahead.
I just wanted to quickly respond to one question in the chat that I think is a good question. It's about if you're qualified in an inventory or pool, can you reach out to ask about the status? Yes, definitely. And if you are qualified in a pool or inventory, I mean, that is wonderful and congratulations, because it is a huge accomplishment to get into a pool or inventory, and you don't have to sit back and wait once you're in one. That gives you like a ticket to then reach out to potential hiring managers and say, hey, I'm in a partially qualified pool. That makes it really a lot easier for other managers to potentially pull you from that pool and then assess you on the criteria that they need for their particular position. But if you're in one, congratulations, that's a huge accomplishment, and you can then take action based on that.
Thanks for that, Holly. I'd missed that question. Okay, well, thank you to Holly, Charlie, and Lily for joining me today as the panelists in today's discussion. And thank you all for joining us today. I saw at one point we had over 1,200 participants, which is awesome. And there were so many great questions that we were able to go through today. For anyone who's interested, the links to today's resources will be found on the CBC Wiki page. And someone is dropping the link into the chat space right now. Make sure you join the CBC 2022 networking event featuring the regional young professional networks on the wonder.me platform at 4:30 Eastern today. The link to that will also be in the chat space. And finally, don't miss out on this afternoon's session, which is applying TikTok principles to interview storytelling, which starts at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you all, and wishing you a great rest of the day. Take care, everyone.